Samuel 26 tonight. 1 Samuel chapter 26. Some of the things that we've experienced so far with David. David's been on the run for his life. He is a fugitive. There is a contract out on his life, and he's being sought after by the king of the land. A king who's a very much like a wartime king. He's a warrior king, and he's paranoid. He has allowed his feelings and his thoughts to get the best of him, and he's imagining all of these terrible things. And I don't know if you've ever met somebody who was being faced with something like dementia or something like that, where they think things are real and they're not, and yet they're terrified and they begin to act on it. That's what Saul was, and Saul's been chasing David down. At one point, you'll remember that he was very close to catching David, and the only thing that spared David's life was a report from the northern section of Israel, that the Philistines were attacking. And so Saul left there and went back to deal with the Philistines. Well, now as we enter chapter 26, he's dealt with the Philistine invasion, and now he's back on David's trail again. You'll remember that when he was in the cave of En-Gedi, either resting or taking care of his business, David had crept up behind him, intending to kill him. The Holy Spirit had spoken to his heart, and David had obeyed the Spirit of God and had not killed him, but instead he cut a piece off his robe. And when he let Saul know this later, Saul said things like, "Oh, you're a better man than I am. I know you're going to be a great king, and I'm not going to hurt you anymore." And now we come into chapter 26, and what do we find? Saul's after David yet again. Maybe one way we can help understand this is that Saul has, all of the people that are around Saul have come from one area. They've come mainly from the tribe of Benjamin. And this is the tribe that Saul belonged to. And all of them realize that when Saul's out of the picture, or if Saul's out of the picture, their power and their prestige is gone. And so they are probably the ones who are feeding the fire, as it were, to Saul, to keep Saul so enraged and so angry at David. I think he probably actually, after the incident at En-Gedi, I think he really intended to leave David alone. But people like Doeg the Edomite, and probably Abner, who was his commander-in-chief over the armies, these men stood to lose everything if Saul's out of the picture and David becomes king, because David's not from their tribe. David's not from Benjamin. David's from Judah. And so these guys are probably behind the scenes. They're egging him on. And you remember one thing we said about Saul was Saul allows whatever's in front of him to influence his emotions. And so as they're standing there saying to him, "You know, David's really out to get you. David, you need to take care of him. He's a threat to you." Their motivations were not right. They were trying to preserve themselves, and yet they're pushing him. And so you've got Saul, and he's got a standing army of 3,000 guys, and in chapter 26, he's heading out after David again. So let's take a look here at chapter 26. I can get it pulled up here. The Ziphites. Now, have you ever had a group of people that just had it in for you? I mean, you know, it seemed like whatever you did, it didn't matter because they were out to get you. That's not a pleasant place to be in. David had some of those people. The Ziphites were some of them. You'll remember that the Ziphites had already gone to Saul once and said, "Hey, David's hiding out near us." And Saul said, "Go back and find out where he is and then come back and tell me." And now here again in chapter 26, the Ziphites go to Saul at Gibeah and say, "Hey, David is hiding on the hill of Hakilah, which faces Jeshimon." Now, this was a very, very good place for David to be. It was a place with plenty of room. And David's got like 600 guys with him now. And those 600 men have got wives and children. And there's other guys who have attached themselves. So the 600 were like the core group. David's probably got 1,000 or more that are with him at this point. And so they said, okay, here he is. And so Saul comes back down now with his 3,000 select Israelite troops, and he searches for David. And he makes his camp near where David's been camping. Now this is really, really interesting. And you're going to see something that sounds like what happened back in chapter 24, when David found Saul in the cave of En-Gedi. And now we see Saul and his men are camped. And when they camped in those days, they sometimes took tents with them, but sometimes they didn't take tents. And this is one of the didn't take tents times. And so David and his men have heard Saul's here in the area. So David takes 2 of his guys, a guy named Ahimelech and a guy named Abishai, and they go to where Saul and his army are. So when they approach them, it kind of reminds me of Gideon. Do you remember the story of Gideon from Judges, where they were kind of camped down in the valley, and Gideon and his men approached, and then Gideon actually went with his servant down into the camp to listen to what was going on, and God encouraged him, and he was able to pull the army together, and with 300 men, he won the battle. Well, that may have been on David's mind, but David sees this encampment here, and the way they camped in those days, they had all of, it was kind of like, sort of like the old wagon train concept from the West, where they would form a circle, and they put the wagons on the outside, and all the families would be on the inside to protect against like Indian attacks or something. They put all their supplies in a ring around the edge, and then the soldiers would be in circular formation as you went in. So if you can just get the picture, just think of a bunch of guys, and you know, you got 3,000 guys, and they're all in this big circle, and they're all camping around the center of the circle, which is where Saul is. And Saul and Abner are right there in the center. Abner, of course, being the general of the army, he's the one who's supposed to be primarily meant to protect Saul's life. And so Saul's there, and his spear is stuck in the ground. And so David and Abishai and Ahimelech are standing on the edge, and they're looking down into this camp, and they see what's going on, and suddenly David gets this idea. Guys, I'm going down. Who's going with me? Abishai said, I'm going. Now Abishai was David's nephew. Abishai was the son of a lady named Zeruiah. It's a strange name, but it wasn't strange back in those days. And she was Jesse's sister. So this is David's cousin. Okay, it's his first cousin. and as well, Abishai, Asahel, and the other one is Joab. They're all 3 brothers, the sons of Zeruiah, and they are first cousins of David. And so Abishai says, all right, I'm with you. And so for whatever reason, Ahimelech, the Hittite, and we don't really know anything about Ahimelech except that he was a Hittite, and this is the last we hear of him. So we don't know really anything about him. But there were several people from the Hittite tribes who actually were part of David's mighty men, his administration. Remember a very well-known gentleman by the name of Uriah the Hittite, who was the husband of Bathsheba, was one of David's 30 mighty men. And so this is the same nationality as a Hittite, and he was with David, part of his group of men. So he stays, but Abishai and David creep down into the camp. Now just imagine what that must have been like. I mean, maybe there were stars out. I don't know, but everybody's snoring away, okay? And they're all on the ground, they're sawing logs, and David and Abishai are just walking through. That was a big guy. I'm going to step over him, you know. And they're creeping out all the way over. And see, the purpose of them all camping in a ring was to protect the king in the center. Because if somebody's going to come in, the guys on the edge are going to hear him. But they didn't hear him. And they get right up to where David and Abishai are standing next to Saul. And Saul's sawing logs. His spear stuck in the ground. His water jug, in case he woke up in the middle of the night, his water jug is there so he can take a drink of water. And as they're standing there, Abishai says, "Let me strike him to the ground." He said, "They'll never hear it. One pierce, he's gone. God has delivered him into your hands. Let me do it, David." David says, "What are you thinking, Abishai? How could we touch the Lord's anointed and not be guilty?" So he reaches out, he grabs the spear, picks up the jug, and they creep back out of this circle of 3,000 men. So when they get out, now the Bible does say, maybe they were clumsy and they needed God's help, or maybe, I don't know, maybe they were light sleepers, but it says that a deep sleep from the Lord had come upon them. And so they're creeping back out, and they climb the hill, and when they get up on the hill, David gets Abner's attention. And he says, right here, it's down in verse 13, "Aren't you going to answer me, Abner?" Now this is the middle of the night, okay? And I don't know if you've ever been awakened out of a sleep and been startled. I went to a boarding school when I was in high school. Crazy things happen in boarding school. Okay, we had this thing that we did sometimes. If like our roommate was asleep, we would get a couple of guys and a couple of flashlights and a rolled up newspaper, and you walk in, they're sound asleep. And you whap them with the newspaper and turn the lights on and yell, "Truck!" And you can imagine what happens when they wake up. It's like, "Oh!" Well, Abner is in a deep sleep, asleep from God, and he hears this voice that he probably recognizes because he used to sit at table with David. You see, Abner was, it was Saul and Jonathan and Abner and David. They were the four most important men in the kingdom. He knew David. And he hears this voice, "Aren't you going to answer me, Abner?" Abner wakes up and he looks around and he says, "Who are you that calls to the king?" David, still, he can't figure out where David is now. Abner's a military man. He's assessing the situation. He's looking in all directions. He's kind of pinpointed the general area where the voice is coming from. And he says, David says to him, "You're a man, aren't you? Who's like you in Israel? Why didn't you guard your lord the king? Someone came to destroy your lord the king. What you have done is not good." He's just kind of needling him. And it's the middle of the night. The guy just woke up. There are some people that if you wake them up like that in the middle of the night, they'll smack you. And I can imagine Abner was kind of feeling like that. "As surely as the Lord lives, you and your men must die because you did not guard your master, the Lord's anointed. Look around you." And, Abner's already doing that. And he said, then David says, "Where are the king's spear and water jug that were near his head?" And Abner looks around. Now, this is significant. And I saw this when I was studying this afternoon. The spear was the equivalent of the king's scepter in those days. God put a deep sleep on the men so that David could slip in. And what does David walk off with? David bypasses the opportunity to kill him, and instead he grabs the scepter. How significant is that? David has already been anointed to be the next king. And so David has walked right in with God's blessing and help, and he has snagged the identification mark of the king. And so now he's standing in the dark, and by now the men are starting to wake up. They're hearing this interchange going back and forth. And the men know that the spear is like the scepter. And so they're hearing this, and then Saul is getting involved, and he says, and listen to this hypocrite. "Is that your voice, David, my son?" You're trying to kill him. And you're calling him David, my son? Come on. David does not respond angrily or sarcastically. He just says, yes, it is, my lord the king. Notice how polite. Now, true, we don't know what his tone of voice was like, but knowing David, I think we could say safely, David was being very, very respectful. And then he says, why are you pursuing me? What have I done? What am I guilty of? Let my lord the king listen to his servant's words. If God's incited you against me, then may he accept an offering. If, however, people have done it, may they be cursed before the Lord. Remember how I told you at the beginning that the reason Saul kept getting agitated and worked up was because these guys that had everything to lose were feeding him lies about David. And this is where David knows what's going on. He understands that they're trying to take and to get Saul to kill him so that they can preserve things for themselves. But look at here. This gives us just a little glimpse of what David was feeling. They have driven me today from my share in the Lord's inheritance and have said, go serve other gods. Well, now Saul never really said that, and none of the men said, go serve other gods. But they did force David by trying to kill him, and they kept him away from the place where he could worship, and he could worship at the tabernacle. And so it was in essence saying, we don't want you anymore, you're out of here. And so since David couldn't go to the place where he was supposed to worship, it was like they were saying, go serve other gods. That's why he says this. And then he says, now do not let my blood fall to the ground far from the presence of the Lord. David has an idea that God's only with Israel. Now his understanding of where God is grows. As he continues to walk with God, it grows. But right now, David is at one of the lowest points of his life and is about to move into the lowest part of his life. And so he's not really sensing the presence of God a whole lot at this point. And he feels like that he's going to die far away from his God. And he loves his God with all his heart because he's still equating his God with being in Israel and in this kind of like the center of Israel. And look how he looks at himself. The king of Israel has come out to look for a flea, as one hunts a partridge in the mountains. David mentioned and even called himself a flea back in chapter 24 also, when he had this same kind of an interchange with Saul. One of the interesting things I found is that I was looking over different commentators today. They're kind of divided about this story. About half of them felt like this is not a separate story from chapter 24, but is in fact just more details about the same incident. They felt like there was not a likelihood that it would have happened twice. I look at things a little differently. I tend to agree with the commentators who said, you know, there's too much difference here. In the one, he was in a cave, and this one, he's outside. And the other one, the first one in the cave, it doesn't say that anybody was with him. He may have been. Abishai may have been with him for all we know, but it doesn't say that. This one, Abishai's definitely with him. In that one, it was a piece of the robe that was cut. In this one, it's the spear and the water jug that are taken. And even, I took a couple of minutes today and I copied over what David said to the king after the En-Gedi cave incident and what he said to him after the spear and the water jug incident. And the content of what he's saying is even different. And so I tend to think that if the Bible says that this happened a second time, it happened a second time. I don't think we need to reason it away and say, well, this is just more details about the same situation. It's not likely it would have happened. I don't care if it was likely or not. It's not likely that a man's going to get swallowed by a fish. But the Bible said Jonah was, and so I believe it, okay? So I think it really did happen. It's a second time. And this time, he's really touched. Saul's really touched for the moment, remember, what's in front of Saul is what influences his emotions. And right now, he's straining through the darkness to see and to hear David. David's in front of him, so David's influencing his emotions. And so he says this. He says, I lost my place. I have sinned, he says, verse 21. Come back, David, my son. I have sinned. Come back, David, my son. Do you think David's going to go back to the palace now? He's been on the run for several months at least, maybe even a year and a half or longer. He's got 600 men or more. He's got another group of their wives and their children, all of whom look at him as though he's their leader, the rightful leader. He's not going to go back, not to mention the fact that when he was there, Saul tried to kill him. When he was running, Saul tried to kill him. But look what he says. Because you considered my life precious today, I will not try to harm you again. Surely, I have acted like a fool and have been terribly wrong. Now, to Saul's credit, Saul does not, from this point on, chase David anymore. But there's a reason why. If David had not done what he's about to do, Saul would have continued chasing him. And in fact, the more I think about it, I think this has probably been over a period of a couple of years, because we're really getting close to the end of Saul's life at this point. So Saul says, I will not chase you. I will not try to harm you. I've acted like a fool. And he actually doesn't from this point on. But it's only because he didn't have opportunity. Okay? So David wraps it all up and he says, let one of the young men come over here. This is the king's spear. I'm going to give you the scepter back. How honorable is that? David was the next rightful king. The Spirit of God had already departed from Saul. He did not have the right to still hold that scepter, but David knew it wasn't up to him to take it. It was up to God to give it to him. And so David decides he's going to wait. And look what he says here in verse 23. The Lord rewards everyone for their righteousness and faithfulness. The Lord delivered you into my hands today, but I would not lay a hand on the Lord's anointed. As surely as I valued your life today, so may the Lord value my life and deliver me from all trouble. And so Saul says, may you be blessed, David, my son. What a hypocrite. You will do great things and surely triumph. So why are you trying to kill him? David goes on his way and Saul returns home. Well, there's a lot of truth in this, and I want to share some things with you. First off, love your enemies. That is so hard to do. But David is such a powerful example when he sees Saul asleep. He could have had Saul killed. They could have been out of there. Everything would have unraveled. Nobody would have known. They wouldn't have even known that he was involved. Kill Saul. How'd you go? And all of a sudden the report is all around Israel. Oh my goodness. Somebody sneaked into the camp and killed King Saul. Oh, we need a new king. But David didn't take that. David chose to respond in love to those who had hurt him. Refuse to pay others back for the wrongs they've done to you. We want to do it. We want to pay them back. And we pay them back by our attitudes. We pay them back by refusing to talk to them. We pay them back by snubbing them, acting like they're not there. But it doesn't matter what they've done to us. I don't know that any of us have faced anything quite like David did, where somebody put a contract on his life, was actively trying to kill him, and yet David chose to show love to his enemies. He didn't practice what Moses had taught, which was an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. If you try to kill me, I'll try to kill you. I'll never forget my son when he was growing up. We tried to talk to him about the golden rule. Do unto others as you would have others do unto you. And we would drill that into him. And so he would do something to his sister, and we'd get on his case about it. We'd say, Christian. He said, well, she did it to me. So, it says, the Bible says, do unto others what you would have others do unto you. So she did it to me, so she wanted me to do it to her, so I did it.
Smart man.
Yeah, he was. We've got to refuse to pay others back, okay? Leave the vengeance with God. Refuse to allow personal pain to motivate your actions. That's hard. That's very difficult. It's easy if you're not feeling the pain. How many of you, when you were raising your children, how many of you got advice on raising your children from somebody who had never raised a child? It's very easy when we're not in the middle of pain to say, don't let pain motivate your actions. Very easy. Just like it was easy for them to tell you how to raise your children. But we've got to remember, if we allow pain to drive our actions, it's almost like, I heard this illustration years ago. It's like anger is like a spray can. And I don't know if you've ever worked with spray paints or not, but they can get all over everything. And if you're spraying somebody, and let's say Bradley's this little kid, and I'm his dad, and I've got this spray can, okay? And it's anger, and I'm just venting this anger, I'm just spraying him all over. What's going to happen is when Bradley gets older, Bradley's going to grab a spray can, and he's going to spray people. Because it happens that way. So it's kind of a never-ending cycle. We've got to refuse to allow our personal pain to motivate our actions. And then show grace to those who would hurt us. David certainly did this. Now, remember, Saul's like, oh, come home, David, my son. I promise I'll never hurt you again. Be careful about smooth words when the actions don't match. Kind of sounds like Washington, D.C., doesn't it? Beware of smooth words when their actions don't match. Saul could talk it up good, and then the next thing you know, he'd have been right back on David's case trying to kill him. We need to remember that we will reap what we sow. David says right down the end, listen, God's watching. And God saw that I had the opportunity to kill you, and may God take care of it. May God take care of it. God is the one who rewards. And we must understand that this life can't be all there is. It can't be. Because there's so many inequalities. There's so many things that aren't right in this world. There has to be an afterlife where everything gets balanced out. God is the one who provides the reward. And think about people like Saul. When my daughter was young, and she would come home and she'd say something about somebody did this to her at school or somebody treated her wrong, I'd try to help her to understand what they might be going through. And it gave her a different perspective on people. And we have to remember that most of the people who make you and I miserable are miserable themselves. And if we can step back from the situation and realize, oh, instead of going head to head, battling it out like two wrestlers in the ring, step back and think, wait a minute, that person's probably pretty miserable. Okay, go ahead and turn it off.